I'm, of course, still continuing my series here through Matthew, and as I've outlined Matthew into sections, we're in section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, which is roughly from the end of chapter 20 all the way through to the end of chapter 25. So all of that is one section, that's section 6, of course, and that I've given that a title, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders, because much of what he does here is themed around that, and that is how his last visit to Jerusalem went before his crucifixion. Now within section 6, we're currently studying a portion that I've labeled the third portion of this section, and I've called this portion The Insightful King Silences the Fools, which I think comes very easily from what is all happening here, because this is the portion where a bunch of the leaders of Israel and the opponents of Jesus are coming to Jesus one by one with their difficult questions, and he is answering them and in some way or other silencing them or shaming them in front of all these crowds that are there. And he ends this, as we will find out maybe within several weeks, on another note about his kingship. So he is the insightful king silencing the fools. All of that, I think, summarizes what's happening here in this third portion. And for several sermons now, I've been on this one question that is asked by the Pharisees, which is question number 3 in this series of questions. So let's read that passage again. This is Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 34. It says, "But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked a question, testing him. 'Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?' And he said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend the whole law and the prophets.'" Now, this third question that was aimed at Jesus has such an important answer that I've decided to dedicate 5 sermons to it. And there could have been more, for sure, but I've decided to limit myself to 5 for this little series that I have on this passage here. Now, my first message several weeks ago was the biblical definitions of love, which was some teaching that I had done before several years ago, but I decided to bring it back into this conversation because it's very much on the same topic of love and what it actually means. And the definitions that I gave you for love, I said there were 2 that the Bible seems to presuppose when it talks about love. And one of them is active delight, and the other is sincere kindness. So I applied those to this passage just to help us understand what Jesus is saying. And then in my second message, I argued that in this passage, the answer of Jesus to the Pharisees exposes their ignorance of their own hatred. And that very much has to do with Matthew's way of presenting this information to us in a way that I think targets the blind hatred, as I called it, of the Pharisees. And then my third and most recent message on this passage, I argued that Mark records the same event with different details because he has a different purpose. And I took you through the different, the differences really between Matthew and Mark's account and showed how they were different from each other, but also that they were similar enough to be the same event. So the question arises, why are the differences there? Well, it's because Mark wanted to bring different things forward in order to prove a different purpose. And in his account, I suggested to you that he chose to focus on the role of loving God and loving your neighbor as the law for the coming kingdom. I thought that best represented the details that he brings out of this event, and he wanted to give weight to those things as he was recording this. So those are the first 3 messages that I did. That gives us 2 left to get through for this particular passage. And for each one of those, I plan to target one of these 2 commandments that Jesus quotes and says together that they are the greatest commandments and that they support the entire law and the prophets. So next time will be the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. So that'll be what I'm doing in my next sermon. Today's sermon is focused entirely on the first and greatest commandment, to love God completely. which is how I summarize all the different descriptions of this love that are given there in this particular commandment, to love God completely. And that is my title for this sermon because I couldn't think of a more clever one, loving God completely. That is what we're talking about, so it's a fitting title. And I wanted to give you my outline, which has 3 headings, so you can follow along with me a little better as I get moving through all the material I have for you. So heading number 1 is that Matthew has shaped his translation of this commandment for the need of the moment. So even now, we're not quite into the commandment itself as it stands alone as a commandment from God to us. We're still dealing a little bit with how Matthew has worded this and how Matthew has used it in recording this particular encounter with the Pharisees. So that's heading number 1. Heading number 2 is that this great commandment describes a complete love for God. And in that heading, I plan to go through the different descriptions that are given in the commandment for how we're supposed to love God and just show you how they together represent a complete love for God. And then finally, in my last heading, I want to make the point that Moses describes how this first and greatest commandment will be fulfilled among us, because Moses actually does have something to say about that back in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30 in particular, as to how this particular commandment will come to its fulfillment in us. So that's what we're doing today. Now, one thing is certain from this sermon, from this particular topic we have, that you don't need to wonder how it applies to your life. We're talking about the first and greatest commandment. If you're looking for something to do, you now know what you ought to be doing. You're supposed to be loving God in the way described in this greatest commandment. So on the one hand, the application is very simple. Love God like this. So we have a very clear application, a very simple application. However, that is bringing with it its own difficulty as well, because here we are in one sermon, somehow trying to talk intelligently and fully about how to love God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our strength, all of our mind, and how we do those things and what those things actually mean, and then how to do them. So really what we're doing here is we're trying to jam all of that into one sermon, which is really not possible. This is something that you're supposed to be studying for your entire life, every day of your life, and really something you're supposed to be studying and doing for all eternity, because this is the chief element of eternity that really we face as Christians as we're looking forward to being with Christ and being with God. The whole agenda for eternity future is to love God in this way in greater and greater measure. So really, this particular sermon is only just a beginning. Hopefully it is a good beginning as we start to think about these things and try to live by them. But we're very much limited by time. All I can do with you this morning is give you a push in the right direction and hope that it carries you further forward for the rest of your life. And that is what we're trying to do today, trying to make a good beginning on studying this first and greatest commandment that Jesus gave us about loving God. So let's start with heading number 1. Heading number 1, as I said, has a little bit more to do with what Matthew is trying to accomplish. And I said that Matthew has shaped his translation for the need of the moment. Now, before you can understand what I mean by that, I need to take you back to the first preaching of this greatest commandment in the days of Moses, because that is where Jesus is getting this. He's actually getting this from something Moses said, and that is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, if you want to turn there. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Now, when Moses originally told Israel to love God and commanded them to love God in this way, he used a rather odd expression that's going to have our attention for this whole heading, really. And I'm going to read to you as it's written here in the NASB, and then we'll talk about the wording that Moses uses. But this is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5, where he says this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might." And that's all we're going to read from the passage, because that gives us the greatest commandment there. And you see that Moses describes this love for God that we're supposed to have in 3 ways. He says you're supposed to love him with all your heart, with all your soul, and as many translations say, all your might. And that is very, very common, so I can't be too critical of that translation there. But that third and final description given by Moses is actually strange enough to warrant some special discussion. And that is what we're primarily doing here in this first point. Even as we try to focus on what Matthew is doing, we have to start with Moses and what he literally says at this point as he gives this command. What Moses literally says is that you should love the Lord your God with all your very. All right, now getting that from, of course, the Hebrew text here, the Hebrew word used there is me'oth, which is a very common Hebrew word. It's one that has a very specific meaning. There's no question as to what it means. It's the word that they use to describe a noise as very loud, or a man as very tall, or a knife as very sharp. When it says in Genesis that the Lord saw that all that he had made in it was very good, it's that word, me'oth. This is that word. It's the word that simply means very. So as strange as it is to say that, Moses' commandment here, the way he words it, is to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all of your very. Now, that is definitely a very unusual phrase to use, very much unprecedented in the rest of the Hebrew Bible, except for one place that seems to quote this particular commandment. It's very unusual, and as I say it out loud, it certainly sounds unusual. That said, it is a phrase that does convey something. I think if you hear it and you just let it land on you with the force that it normally has, it certainly conveys the idea that you're supposed to take your love for God to the next level. This is not a time for moderation. This is not a time for restraint. You're supposed to be a little bit extreme about this. You're supposed to love God with all of your very. You're supposed to ratchet it up to the next level. I think the phrase conveys that, and that is possibly why Moses used that particular expression to convey this commandment. However, if you're a Bible translator and you want to translate these things in a way that is helpful to people, you want to give them a little bit of help in understanding things here. So pretty much no one actually translates it that way. I don't think I found a single English translation that says, love God with all your very. Most Bible translations do something a little different here, and they're trying to help you. They're trying to help you understand the force of this. So we can't be critical of them for doing that. I'm not critical of them by any means, but I do want you to know what's going on here and the choices that Bible translators make at this point. Now, most translations say something like, loving the Lord your God with all your might. That's how the NASB translates it. That's how a lot of English translations handle this particular phrase. That goes all the way back to the Greek Septuagint translation. When they first translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, they used the word dunamis, which is power or might or strength. They used that word to translate this particular phrase. So it has some heritage behind it to translate it that way. However, the Jews did use some other words to translate this particular commandment. They didn't just use the word for might. Eventually, the Hebrews started to speak Aramaic more often than they spoke Hebrew. So there was some effort to translate the Old Testament into Aramaic. Those are the Targums. If you ever hear the Targums referred to by anybody, those are the Aramaic paraphrases of the Old Testament. And there, whenever they gave this commandment in the Aramaic Targums, they said, love God with all your wealth. So they're bringing in material considerations here, the stuff you have. Use that to love the Lord your God, not just heart and soul, but your money as well. And I just give you those examples to show you the different ways that the Jews tried to bring out the force of this commandment. Moses says, love God with all of your very, and how you translate that is going to depend on what that conveys to you and what you think is best in that given moment for actually conveying this commandment to love God with all your heart, soul, and very. Now, dealing then as we are with translations and interpretations, we have the question, is there any other way you might translate this? Is there any other way you might interpret this for somebody to help them understand it? Well, yes, there is. And Mark and Luke give us another example of this. And you don't necessarily have to turn to their Gospels, but I do want to read what Mark and Luke say, because they seem to give us the earliest Christian interpretation of the greatest commandment. So the Christians now weighing in on what it means to love God in this way. And we get this from Mark's gospel and Luke's gospel. From Mark, we see this in Mark chapter 12, verse 30, where this is again the same event as we see over in Matthew. But the way he words the greatest commandment is this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. So that is how Mark has decided to handle this particular commandment. What Luke does is very similar. Now, Luke does not record this same story, but he does record another event where Jesus quotes this commandment, and that is in Luke chapter 10, verse 27. This is just before the parable of the Good Samaritan, and his quotation is this. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. So Luke actually says the same thing as Mark, but he switches the last two. So mind and strength are both there. They're just flipped around depending on who you're reading at the moment. So in these passages, we see how two of our four Gospels handle this third description of our love for God. Moses said, love God with all your very, and when Mark and Luke got around to writing their Gospels, they translated that third element in this particular way, with strength in mind. Quite possibly, that goes back to Jesus himself. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Jesus himself suggested that translation as he was teaching on these things, and that Mark and Luke got it from him. That would not be surprising at all. However, we don't know that for sure. I don't want to say that is a certain thing because it's not, but it could very well go back to Jesus himself. In the very least, it goes back to Mark and Luke in these two Gospels. So in both of these passages, these men write that we should love God first with all of our heart, and secondly with all of our soul, which is very much a standard translation, quotation really, of what Moses had to say. So they don't depart from him there. However, Mark and Luke do end their description, instead of with one other phrase, they end it with two more. So whereas Moses has 1, 2, 3, Mark and Luke have 1, 2, 3, 4, where they throw in mind and strength as descriptions of what your love for God should be like. So that is a little bit different than what Moses actually wrote. And you could object to that if you wanted to, and you say, well, Moses has 3 descriptions, you guys have 4, so you're stepping out of line with what Moses said. However, I think you can see the reasoning behind that. I mean, Moses said, love the Lord your God with all your very. What does that mean? Well, you got to find some way to say that. And I think for Mark and Luke and the earliest Christians apparently, they described that by talking about your mind and your strength, which when you think about it, covers a lot of ground. The mind is internal, your strength is external. It's not just body, it's also immaterial. It's not just physical, it's also these immaterial things like your thoughts, your attitudes, those kinds of things. So together, mind and strength, they cover a lot of ground. So if you want to say, love God with all your very, and you want to translate that into other words, throwing in mind and strength actually does a pretty good job of that, because it covers a pretty broad range of what it is to be a living, breathing human. You have your strength, you have your mind, along with your heart and your soul. So if you want to talk about loving God in that way, mind and strength are not bad choices for that. So though it may seem odd at first, Mark and Luke simply prefer a different way of conveying what Moses commanded. They decide to translate that idea by using this phrase, mind and strength. And that's all they're doing. Now at this point you might be wondering, what about Matthew? Because we started off reading his passage, and he does something a little bit different than these two. So let's go back to Matthew and see what he's up to. Back in Matthew 22, we'll just read verse 37 because that's where he quotes this commandment. He quotes it like this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. The end. He just cuts it off right there after saying heart, soul, and mind. So that's how Matthew words this commandment. Now, like Moses, in his defense, like Moses, he gives 3 descriptions. Moses gave 1, 2, 3. Matthew gives 1, 2, 3. In that regard, you could say that he is more faithfully translating Moses' commandment here in terms of length anyway. Also, Matthew is similar to Mark and Luke in at least one respect in that he uses the word mind. We saw that in both those other Gospels, so he's in line with what other early Christian writers were saying as they talked about this commandment. But the real difference here is that Matthew does not include loving God with all of your strength. That is different than what Mark and Luke do. He just cuts it off at mind. So in Matthew, it's just heart, soul, and mind. That's all Matthew does. Now, by not mentioning strength, could we accuse Matthew, perhaps, of failing to fully translate this idea of loving God with all your very? Could we say, well, Matthew, Mark and Luke gave us 2 words to describe that, and they did a pretty good job. Here you are talking just about mind. What are you up to, Matthew? What are you doing? Why leave out that other part? Why are you taking away from what Moses intended us to feel as we read this great commandment? And you could be really critical about Matthew at this point, but really all we have to do is ask one question, and that is, what is Matthew trying to do with the way he words the commandment at this point? Why does he focus only on the mind there at the end of his quotation of this greatest commandment? Why does he do that? Well, as always, you find your clues to the purpose by looking at the context. What is going on here in this passage? Well, in this passage, Jesus has this confrontation with the Pharisees, and as I argued a few messages ago, I think Matthew is deliberately shaping the details of this story to convey this implied rebuke from Jesus about their own lack of love for God and their lack of love for Him as well. This is very much meant to be an implied rebuke to them. Here they are asking about these moralistic matters. What is the great commandment of the law? But here they are breaking the 2 greatest commandments, which they would have known, but they're just so ignorant of the fact that they don't see what they're doing. Now, because their problem is ignorance, their ignorance of their own selves and their ignorance of what they're doing, I think for that reason, Matthew targets loving God with all your mind. Because these Pharisees, and this lawyer in particular, they're not doing that. They're kind of on autopilot right now. They've heard this stuff. They know what the greatest commandment is. They're fine with that. But they're not thinking about what they know and applying it to their situation. They're not asking themselves, hey, am I living by this? In my way of interacting with this Jesus fellow, am I actually practicing love? Does this say anything about my love for God, that I have such hostile attitudes toward this man who's preaching truth? They're not even thinking about all that. They're just plainly ignorant of who they are, and what they're doing. And I think that's why Matthew ends his translation of this greatest commandment with the word mind. I think he wants to emphasize for us as we read this that in order to love God in this way, your mind has to be engaged, unlike these Pharisees. That's what I think Matthew is doing. So yes, on the one hand, you could say his translation is selective, but it is very suitable according to what he's trying to show. I don't think he's forgotten what Moses meant to say. I don't think he's forgotten the way other Christians have translated this. He just wants to end this on a note that strongly condemns the Pharisees and prompts us to do better than they're doing. That's what I think Matthew is doing, and that's what I mean when I say that he has shaped his translation for the need of the moment. He has in mind this confrontation with the Pharisees and what he wants us to learn from that. So all of that to give you an explanation of how this commandment is variously worded throughout Scripture, and also what Matthew is doing in his treatment of this great commandment. And that is all the first heading for today. So let's move on to the second one. In my second heading, I want to come to the true center of this commandment, the actual point of this commandment, and that is the need to love God completely. And again, loving God completely is just my way of summarizing all these different descriptions we're getting. Heart, soul, mind, strength, whatever else we might say there. It's all about loving God completely, meaning that you're supposed to bring your entire self, all that you are, into your love for God. So what I want to do in this second heading is I want to study each of these different descriptions that we have from Scripture about what our love for God is supposed to be like, and just go through them, try to make some statement of explanation for them, and try to apply that to us in some way. That's all I want to do. So let's start with this one. Let's start with loving God with all your strength, as Mark and Luke say, and as is very commonly used to translate that last part of what Moses says. So let's start with loving God with all your strength. So I have a question here for the children in the audience, and I don't know what kind of answers I'm going to get out of you for this, but let's just see what happens here. I just wanted to ask you kids if you think you have ever done anything with all of your strength. You've put all of yourself, all the power you have into some particular task. Do any of you have any example of that? You, what do you think? Doing pull-ups. That is a great example. What's it like doing pull-ups? How many can you do? Not even one, but you put all your strength into that. Okay? Well, keep trying. You might be able to do one eventually. Any other examples out there? Doesn't have to be a physical thing like hers. Okay. Well, that was a good example, actually. Doing something with all of your strength. When you do something with all of your strength, I'm sure that it comes across in two ways, or at least it should, hopefully. One that I'm sure she has experienced in trying to do those pull-ups. Number one is exhaustion. When you're doing something with all of your strength, you're putting all of your energy to it, you are tired by the time you're done. You feel like you need to go and rest for a little bit, and specifically your arms or your back if you're doing pull-ups like she was doing. So exhaustion, you're doing all this stuff here, and you're just tired by the time it's over. Well, loving God should first of all be like that. If you love God with all your strength, there should be a bit of fatigue there by the time you're done. In the ways that you love God, the way that you act that out in your life, it should leave you at the end of the day feeling like, wow, I really need to get some good sleep tonight because this was a very busy day, this was a tiring day, I feel exhausted. Your love for God should leave you feeling like that, first of all. Now, if that seems rather terrible to you, that loving God would leave you exhausted or tired, there is a second element to doing something with all of your strength that I'm afraid Esther has not experienced because she can't do one pull-up yet. Hopefully someday she will. But the exhilaration of having done so, that's the other thing. There is exhaustion, but then there's exhilaration, there's joy, there's happiness that comes from that. When you do something with all of your strength and you actually do it, you actually manage to do this thing you were trying to do, there is some exhilaration there. Maybe that's playing some kind of sport, maybe that's exercising, maybe it's finishing some project that you've been trying to get done and you're just working hard at it and you finally get it done. There is a note of joy there that comes with that, of actually pouring yourself into this thing and getting it done. There is exhilaration there. Well, loving God should be like that. It shouldn't just leave you exhausted and tired. There should be this thrill of success. There should be this thrill, this joy that comes from loving God in that way. It should bring you happiness. After all, we're talking about love. This is a positive thing. Loving God with all your strength should be like that. So a question to ask ourselves as we examine ourselves on what our love for God is like, and we think about loving God with all of our strength, we should ask ourselves, have I ever done this in such a way that has left me tired? And have I ever gotten the exhilaration of all that effort by the time I was done doing whatever I was doing for the Lord at that time? Those are good questions to ask as we think about loving God with all of our strength. So there's the first description that we've been given, or at least the first one that I've dealt with here, loving God with all of our strength. So let's move on to the next one. This is Matthew's favorite, loving God with all of our mind. What does it mean to love God with all of our mind? Well, this might seem like a rather cold thing, loving with the mind. After all, we think of love as being more of an emotional thing, bringing our heart into that. But here we are loving God with our mind, apparently. And perhaps that comes across as a rather cold thing to say. But in reality, no love can be truly successful or fully expressed without an element of the mind being brought into it. And I think we know this as we look at other objects of love. Just think about other things, other persons that you might love. If you really want to love these people or these objects, there is a degree of thought that goes into this. This is why men, when they're ready to propose marriage to their future wives, they put all this thought into how they're going to propose. This is also why you parents out there are always seeking advice and counsel on how to parent your children. Why? Because you love your children and you want to do a good job, and you know that you need knowledge to do that. So therefore, you're always trying to seek counsel about how to parent your children the best way possible. We could scroll through the love languages here and think about them. Gift giving, acts of service, words of encouragement, whatever they might be, all of those involve some kind of thought to them. You got to sit there and think about how you're going to do this thing as part of your love for this person. All of these expressions of love only really work if we think about them in advance. You have to bring your mind into it. Now, as for God, loving Him with all of your mind seems to have two steps. And I think this is probably true of anything that you might love, but we're talking about loving God right now. So let's talk about these two steps with regard to God Himself. First of all, you have to understand God. You have to have knowledge of God. Just as we have to understand any person we try to love first before we do something, otherwise we might end up insulting them or hurting them in some way other than what we intended. We don't want to love God in a misguided fashion. We don't want to have misguided zeal as we try to love the Lord. We need to understand who God is and what He wants. That's step one of loving God with all of your mind. The second step, based on what you know about God, you must plan. You must invent. You must contrive ways to love the Lord. You got to take what you know about Him and find some way to give that expression. It involves some planning there. You got to think about this. You got to wake up in the morning and think to yourself, how am I going to address this thing in a way that shows my love for God? How am I going to address this thing in a way that also shows my love for God? You've got to do all of that. You have to understand and plan as part of loving God with all your mind. So that is how this aspect of loving God works. And again, those are questions to ask yourself as you think about your own love for God. Do you study God? Do you seek to understand Him? Do you then take what you've learned and do you apply it in some way? Do you plan that out? These are good questions to ask as we examine ourselves and as we guide ourselves into a deeper love of God. So that is loving God with all of your mind. And of course, together, mind and strength represent this idea from Moses, loving God with all of your very. So far, so good. Now we're getting into some trickier ground here, perhaps. Next on the list is loving God with all of our soul, which is a word that all of these different versions of the commandment give us, all the way back to Moses and into the four Gospels. Loving God with all of your soul is very much part of loving God. And our first challenge here is to answer the question, what is a soul? I thought about torturing you kids by asking you that question, and then I realized I have no idea how I would answer that question either. What is a soul? What do we mean by this thing that we apparently have, that we are really, but what is it? What is a soul? Well, as I was trying to find a way to talk about that, I happened upon a statement that David makes in one of his Psalms, which I actually think is very helpful. This is maybe not a very theological discussion of what the soul is, but for our purposes today, I think it does pretty well. Psalm 103, verse 1. I just want to read the first two lines of this particular psalm and just take something from that. Psalm 103, verse 1, where David says this. He says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless His holy name." So again, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless His holy name. Now that gives us a pretty good clue as to how we should think about what your soul is. Your soul is all that is within you. So when you get down underneath all the flesh and the bone and the blood and everything that is physical, to get down to your really core, what you are, what is within you, all that is within you, that is your soul. And that is part of our love for God, loving God with all of our soul. Now at this point, I think you can begin to see the redundancy in some of these descriptions of how we're supposed to love God. In other words, they overlap quite a bit. We've already talked about loving God with all your mind, but your mind is something that is within you and is therefore part of your soul. So there's definitely some overlap here between loving God with all of your mind and loving God with all of your soul. But we can push this a little bit further here for our purposes and ask, okay, we've already covered the mind, but what else is within us? What else do we have inside of us other than our mind? Well, most obviously, I think, the emotions, our feelings, our passions, those things are also within us, and those things are very much a part of our soul. So let's ask this question. How is our emotional component here, our feelings, how are they engaged in our love for God? Can we go through a list of our emotions and see how they are engaged in our love for God? First of all, do you delight in God? Does God make you happy? I've defined our love for God primarily as an active delight in Him, in this series that I've been preaching. So is there a delight there? Do you delight in God the way you delight in other things? Do you delight in God more than you delight in other things? Those are questions that are perfectly relevant for asking if you love God with all of your soul. But we can go on to other emotions as well. Is there a tone of grief, of sadness sometimes in your love for God? Because love, I hope you're mature enough to realize this in your own life and who you are as a person, that love can bring with it sorrow depending on what's going on. Specifically in terms of love for God, when you sin, that could be a cause of grief. Since you love the Lord but you've sinned, there's a cause for grief there. Or maybe you don't perceive the same nearness to God that you've had in the past. That could be an occasion for sorrow. Because you love the Lord, you want to be with Him, you want to draw near to Him, but you feel like you're not quite there for some reason. That is a good reason to be sad on account of your love for God. So sorrow can play a part in how we love God with all of our soul. Also, here's one. This one's kind of tricky. We come to the topic of righteous indignation, of anger. Very often I think our righteous indignation is not very righteous, but it can be. There can be times where because of your love for God, you're angry at something. We might think of it in this way: jealousy for God, because someone not giving God the glory, someone dishonoring God in some way. Does that get you riled up? Does that make you angry? Well, that'd be a perfectly normal response for someone who loves God, and because of that love becomes angry at some sin or some other thing that is somehow opposed to God. And then finally, we can bring one more emotion into this, and this is kind of a strange one, but fear. The Bible talks about fearing God quite a bit. In some passages, fearing God is the very epitome of what righteousness is. And that fear, though, that can also be tied to your love. And I've done a sermon on this in the past, on the different kinds of the fear of God that we see in Scripture. But there is a kind of fear that brings with it a kind of joy, a kind of rush, because of your great respect and your honor for this person that you love, in this case God. There can be a tone of fear there. They can blend together. So you might ask yourself, as you think about whether you love God, do you fear God? Do you have this reverential fear that is there, that makes you tremble when you think about who God is and all that He's done for you? Is that there? These are just, emotions. Happiness, sorrow, anger, fear. These are things that are within us. These are our feelings. These are part of our soul. And they're supposed to be engaged as we love God. So again, questions to ask yourself. Do you love God with all that is within you? Do you love God with your soul, with these emotions in particular? Those are good questions to ask as we examine ourselves and our love for God. Okay, so we come now to the last description, which actually is the first one because Moses said this first whenever he first gave this commandment. Loving God with all of our heart. We're going to end here in our catalog of these different ways of loving God. Now, all that I said about soul could just as easily be said about the heart. This is more overlap, and here the overlap is probably more complete in terms of things about soul, things about the heart, how much they overlap with each other. They overlap a lot. In fact, to my great frustration, as I was trying to do a word study on these things, I discovered that in the Old Testament, heart and soul are pretty much always used together. Heart and soul, heart and soul. Do you know how frustrating it is to do a word study when they keep using the same two words together over and over again? It is very hard to figure out what these words mean separately when they always put them together. But they do put them together very often because there's a lot of overlap there. There is, however, one thing I found as I was studying this, one thing that they say about the heart in the Old Testament that they never say about the soul, or at least I don't think they ever say it. So this is where we're going to focus our attention here in terms of loving God with all of our heart. The heart can apparently be divided in its loyalty. So thinking here of the topic of your devotion, what has your allegiance? The heart can feasibly be divided in its loyalty. And I have a passage here that illustrates this, I think. This is from 1 Kings chapter 15, and you don't have to go there. I'm just going to read it and move on pretty much. But 1 Kings 15, verses 1 through 3, this is just one of the various kings of Judah that are mentioned in the book of Kings. It says this, "Now in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijam became king over Judah. He reigned 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah. I hope I'm not butchering her name too badly. The daughter of Abishalom. He walked in all the sins of his father, which would have been Rehoboam, the great fool that divided the kingdom. He walked in all the sins of his father, which he had committed before him, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, like the heart of his father David. So there we have this summary description of King Abijam and the flaws in his character, mainly in that his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, like David's heart was. So he has a divided heart, especially toward the Lord at this point. Now, in his case, that was probably mainly a matter of idolatry, because it talks about how Rehoboam was also serving all these idols on these high places, and here Abijam is walking in all the sins of his father, doing those same kinds of things. You've probably never been tempted in that way to not wholly devote your heart to the Lord, but there are plenty of other rivals you could face, and the world is full of them. The world, the flesh, and the devil are constantly contriving to put other things in our lives in place of God, things that we love alongside God, things that we love more than God. There's a whole world of rivals to God out there for you as you look out on the world here. And you are commanded in this commandment from Moses to love God with all of your heart, to not have that kind of divided loyalty, to make sure that your heart is fastened securely in loving the Lord so that he has no rival. So this really is the question I would have you ask about yourself as you think about loving God with all of your heart. Think about your loyalties. Think about your devotion. Where is your heart devoted? Is it wholly devoted to the Lord? Is it split between the Lord and something else? As you think about obeying God in some way and whether you want to, do you feel this strong pull in some other direction? If so, you have a rival. You have a rival to God in your life and a rival for your devotion. And that is something to be eliminated as you try to love God with all of your heart. That is the way I would have you apply this idea of loving God with all of your heart. Which brings us to the end of our list here as we talk about loving God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, and all of our strength, those things together. I think they paint a picture of a very complete love for God, whether it's all that is within us or our loyalties, all of our strength, all of our mind, whatever it may be. If you have this kind of love, there's nothing else left to give, really. You have loved God completely. And that is the kind of love that is commanded in this greatest commandment. Now, under my third and final heading for this sermon, I want to bring out some good news here about how this first and greatest commandment will be fulfilled among us. And I wanted to end on this note because in that second heading, I've given a very tall order here, right? I mean, loving God with all of your heart, soul, strength, and mind. These are pretty weighty things when you really start to think about them. The good news is there is a biblical promise and a true reality here about these things being fulfilled, these things actually being practiced by the people of God. And for this, I want to go back to Moses again, because he says something about this in Deuteronomy chapter 30. I just want to read this passage and make a few comments about it for our encouragement as we keep thinking about this kind of love for God. This is Deuteronomy chapter 30, starting in verse 6, going through verse 16. He says, "Moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. The Lord your God will inflict all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you and who persecute you. And you shall again obey the Lord and observe all his commandments, which I command you today. Then the Lord your God will prosper you abundantly in the works of your hands, in the offspring of your body, and in the offspring of your cattle, and the produce of your ground. For the Lord will again rejoice over you for good, just as he rejoiced over your fathers. If you obey the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of the law, if you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. For this commandment which I command you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us to get it for us, and make us hear it, that we may observe it? Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross the sea for us to get it for us, and make us hear it, that we may observe it? But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may observe it. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, and death and adversity, in that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. There's a whole lot there, but I just have a few observations I want to take from that and from the ideas there and talk about loving God being fulfilled among us. So the first lesson to learn from this passage is only God can create love for God. Okay, this is maybe the first and most important thing to realize, that only God can create love for God. Now, if Moses had said that Israel would circumcise their own hearts, then maybe we could believe that loving God is a power held by mankind. That is the analogy Moses uses here, the circumcision of the heart. And that is his analogy here. And he says, though, that God is the one that has to do that. God is the one that has to get in here and deal with your heart to make you love God in this way. So mankind does not have this power. He has to look to the Lord for this. Now, there's a danger in saying that, because wicked people will always use that kind of truth as an excuse to continue in their wickedness. They will say, well, if only God can do it, I don't have to do it, and therefore I'm going to go and do whatever I want to do. I'm not going to bother with loving God, because if God doesn't do it, I can't. They very often use these kinds of truths in that way. Well, you know what? Let them. Let them continue in that, because there's nothing you can do about it. God, however, is able to enter their lives when they least expect it and turn them around. And God does that sort of thing very often to people who are committed to their wickedness, and then God interrupts their life and circumcises their heart and makes them a new person. So let them do that. I mean, you can't argue with wickedness in that way if they are that stubborn. You can't do anything about it, but God is able. God has that kind of power to circumcise the heart. Now, if, for example, you're a different kind of person, though, not someone who is just committed to wickedness, but someone who wants to love God, but you don't feel like you do. You want to love God, but you don't feel like you're actually there. This kind of thing could be rather grievous to you, to hear that only God can create love for God in your heart. You might be very despondent about that. And people can get into that kind of attitude where they have this despair about whether they're ever going to love God in the way that they should. Well, my encouragement to you is that this kind of grief is actually good, because it shows the beginnings of repentance. You don't want to stop there and just spend the rest of your life in that despair, because that would not be good. That's the kind of despair that leads to condemnation. But if you've gotten that far, it means that God has already started working in your heart in some way. So that is a good thing. You want to continue on in that and continue to focus your mind on these matters. Now, the way that's usually going to play out is it's probably going to play out with you crying out to the Lord to circumcise your heart, to give you that new heart so that you can love God as you ought. That's a very instinctive reaction. I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't do that. After all, if you need a surgery of some kind, you're probably going to get that by going to the doctor. And if you need to have your heart circumcised, if you need to have your heart worked upon so that you can love God, you have to go to God for that. So yes, by all means, cry out to the Lord. If you're of this mind and you're saying to yourself that you want to love God, but you don't feel like that you do, cry out to the Lord about that. Seek the Lord on this. In the meantime, you just have to trust in the Lord that He hears you, and that He hears you when you cry out to Him. And we do have a promise about these kinds of things. James says, draw near to God and He will draw near to you. And that is, I think, a perfect time to apply this kind of promise. If here you are wanting to love God, draw near to Him, pray to Him, cry out to Him for this kind of love. He is able to circumcise your heart and take even the most hardened sinner and make that sinner love Him. He is able to do that kind of work. So that is the first truth that we have and how we apply that truth, that only God can do this, but God does do it. And God is able, and God can do it for you as well. So there's the first observation here from what Moses says about the fulfillment of this kind of love for God. The second one is this, and that is that this kind of love will be painful, or rather I should say getting this kind of love will be painful. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago with regard to the heart that it can be divided in its loyalty, right? You can have a love for this, you can have a love for this other thing. They might be opposite of each other, they might be opposed to each other, and you cannot continue on in that state, especially if loving God is over here and some rival to God is over here. Something has to be done about that. Now, you might think that your job then is to bring this part of your heart in line with the other part so that your whole heart is serving God and loving God. Well, Moses implies something a little different. He implies that the answer to this is actually to cut away that part of your heart that is not devoted to the Lord. Because his analogy, again, is circumcision. This is a cutting away of flesh. This is, we're going to take this piece of you, we're going to hack it off and throw it away and leave you with this other piece of you. And that is how he describes this work that God does on your heart to create love for God. He describes it as a cutting away. So it's a cutting away of these rival loves, of these parts of your heart that are devoted to these other things, which sounds really painful. Anytime you talk about cutting away a part of your body or a part of yourself, that sounds like a very painful and grievous thing. And I think I can appeal to shared Christian experience on this point and say, yeah, it is painful. Because every so often, God decides to deal with you again with these other rival loves that you have. Because God doesn't want a rival for himself. He doesn't want you to have a rival in your love for him. He doesn't want you to live a split life. He wants you to live a whole life, wholly devoted to the Lord, so that you can live with this kind of focus and this kind of power that comes with loving God in that way. So every so often, God is going to do you a very painful favor and cut away these rival loves. He's going to circumcise your heart over and over again in these ways until your heart becomes more and more purely devoted to him. And yes, that is a painful experience, but the end result, like any surgery, is good. This actually helps to heal you. This brings you beyond where you were before into something better. But that is the description we have here, this cutting away of parts of your heart so that you can love God with your whole heart. That is I think the picture that Moses would have us see in this image of heart circumcision. Okay, I have a third one for you here, and this is a very practical one. The great test of loving God is always obedience. Do you obey the Lord or not? That is the question to ask at the end of the day to figure out whether you love God. And Moses says this several times here in Deuteronomy chapter 30. Just to read you one of them, he says, "And you shall again obey the Lord and observe all his commandments, which I command you today." I mean, that is the result that he says there for this heart circumcision that God has planned for his people. So think again about loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Let's assume for a moment that you have all of those united together in your love for God. Now ask, does all that energy and planning and feeling and loyalty lead to obedience? Well, if you have all of those things, how could it not lead to obedience? If all of those things are true of you, how could you not obey the Lord? If you do not live a life in obedience to God, that means there's something wrong with these aspects of your love for the Lord. You're not totally loving him in this way described by Moses. If the object of your love were some earthly king, obedience would be a given. I mean, to say that you love this king but you don't obey him is this, that doesn't even make any sense. Well, how much more in terms of dealing with the Lord, who is a great king, the greatest of all kings. He is a Lord. We call him that, the Lord. It implies that loving him would mean obeying him. And this carries on straight from the law into the gospel. This is not some Old Testament thing that we left behind when Jesus showed up, because when Jesus comes along, he says much the same thing. The famous statement from him is in John 14, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." Obedience. So again, whether you're dealing with the law or the gospel, the great test of whether you love God in this way that Moses describes is your obedience. Do you actually obey God in your life? So that is a great test for you to remember as you ask yourself about your own love for God. Okay, so one more thing here. and coming squarely around to this idea of the love of God being fulfilled among us, all of this is possible. It actually is possible. And I want to assure you of that, even though it should go without saying, because the more we talk about it, the less possible it sounds. To have this kind of wholly devoted love for God that has everything within you directed at loving Him with all of your strength, all of your mind, all of your very. Is this really possible? Well, yes. Yes, it is. It is actually possible for this kind of thing to happen. And I can say that now, at this time in history, more than at any other time in history, because we're living in this era where God is circumcising hearts worldwide. He's doing this all over. Back there in Deuteronomy 30, he's talking about Israel. But it gets to the point where God starts doing this worldwide. There's this description that Paul gives. Paul, of course, is the great apostle to the Gentiles, the man that Christ chose to take his gospel to all the nations of the world. And Paul describes what is happening to these nations as they believe the gospel. He describes this in Romans 2, verses 28 through 29. I just want to read this to you. It says, "For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, and not by the letter. And his praise is not from men, but from God." So as he's talking about what it means for all these Gentiles to start believing in Christ and for his gospel going forth into all these nations, that's how he describes it. This circumcision of the heart, which matters far more than the circumcision of the flesh, contrary to what certain Jews believed back then. This circumcision of the heart was happening in nations that previously weren't even serving God. But God is doing that now through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we're a part of that. We are one of these nations where the gospel has come and God has started to circumcise hearts here. So is it possible to love God in this way? Yeah, God's been doing it. He's been bringing that about in a worldwide scale that no one else even anticipated in this way. So yes, it is certainly possible. It is a progressive thing and it's a painful thing you have to grow into, but God does this. He does it continually in the lives of His people, and He does it more and more as time goes on across the nations of the world. This is the time to love God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our very. God is making sure that is happening in this phase of history, and we're a part of that. So we can draw encouragement from that. Not only has God spoken of these things as though they really are possible, God Himself is bringing them about. They are coming to their fulfillment in Christ at long last. Okay, well, let me give you a summary of all that I've said today here about loving God completely, and then we'll close and get ready for our meal. So I had 3 headings for you today. First of all, Matthew has shaped his translation of this commandment for the need of the moment. And I said that the driving force of this point was the realization that Moses uses this strange phrase, loving God with all of your very, to describe how we're supposed to love God. And different people interpreted that in different ways and translated it in different ways. Matthew translates that part of things in terms of loving God with all of your mind, because that's where he was focusing his attention as he was describing this contest with the Pharisees that Jesus had there in Jerusalem. So he has shaped his translation accordingly. Secondly, I talked about how this great commandment describes a complete love for God. And basically, I went through the list of the descriptions we've been given and just see how they apply to us. We should love God with all of our strength so that our love exhausts us but also exhilarates us. We should love God with all of our mind in that we seek to understand Him and then plan our deeds of love accordingly. We should also love God with all of our soul, which in the very least includes all of our emotions. All of our feelings should be engaged as we love God. And then finally, we should love God with all of our heart, in that we have no split loyalties, and that we have no other devotions other than God in our life. And that is what it means to love God completely. And then finally, I came around here to Deuteronomy 30 and talked about how this commandment is fulfilled among us. I talked about how God Himself has to circumcise the heart in order to create this kind of love. And I talked about how that is a painful experience, how God hacks away these parts of your heart that are not devoted to Him in order to bring about this complete love for God that He desires from us and which is good for us. I talked about how the great result of this is always obedience, and that if you're not obeying God, you therefore do not love God in this way. And then finally, I just reminded you all that we're living in this time in history where God is doing this all over the world, and we're a part of this, and we can take encouragement that this kind of love for God really is possible and actually happening in us and all around us. And that is what I have to say about this first and greatest commandment. Next time when I teach, I'll be talking about loving your neighbor as yourself, and that will be the end of this series on these two great commandments. Are there questions or comments that anyone has at this point on this particular commandment?